She boarded the ship with a quiet elegance, alone, unnoticed. August 27, 2004. Marion Carver, a 40-year-old investment banker from Massachusetts, stepped onto the Celebrity Mercury cruise ship in Seattle, bound for a week-long voyage to Alaska. She had made the booking in secret. No friends, no family knew about this trip. To everyone in her life, she had simply vanished. But she didn't vanish at sea. Not at first. That came later. Marion had been battling internal storms. A once prominent figure in finance, she was also a poet, a mother, a woman who carried herself with grace, but bore the weight of emotional struggles. Her family later revealed she had periods of depression, and this trip may have been her way of seeking peace, reflection, or escape. Cabin 6 John 45. That's where she stayed. A small but luxurious stateroom with a private balcony. She dined alone the first night. The waiter remembered her. Quiet. Polite. She ordered a full meal, ate little of it, and then, like the mist that rolls over the ocean before dawn, Marion Carver was gone. She was never seen again. The next day, the room attendant noticed something strange. The bed hadn't been slept in. He reported it. Once, twice, again. For 5 straight days, Marion's cabin remained untouched. No one entered or exited. No personal items moved. The same towels, the same sheets, the same silence. He told his supervisor. The supervisor told him to just keep his mouth shut. Don't log it. Don't report it. Don't raise flags. Her belongings, including her poetry journal, her clothes, and even her luggage, were eventually discarded, thrown away like forgotten trash at the end of the voyage. And not a single call was made to the authorities. Not to the FBI. Not to the Coast Guard. Not even to her family. Because according to Celebrity Cruises, Marion Carver had never existed on that ship. At least, that's what they wanted the world to believe. When her father, Kendall Carver, realized she was missing, he began calling everywhere. Police, cruise lines, even private investigators. For weeks he received only silence, until he found out, by sheer determination, that she had booked the cruise. That's when the true horror began to unfold. How could an American citizen vanish on a commercial vessel in international waters without triggering any kind of emergency protocol? Why did no one on board, not a single officer, sound an alarm? Why was her cabin cleaned out, her things destroyed, and her presence erased from the records? It wasn't just a disappearance, it was a cover-up, and it would soon become one of the most infamous cruise ship mysteries in modern history, one that would shake the cruise industry to its core, and force the United States Congress to ask questions it had never dared to ask before. Marion's story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Kendall Carver wasn't just a grieving father. He was a man on a mission, and that mission started the moment he realized that no one, not the cruise line, not the authorities, not even the government, was looking for his daughter. It had been weeks since Marion had gone missing, and yet there were no official reports, no investigation, no answers. Just a void, deeper and darker than the ocean itself. He started making calls, hundreds of them. To Celebrity Cruises, he asked, "Was my daughter ever on your ship?" Their answer? "We can't confirm that." To the port authorities in Vancouver, where the ship docked. "Was she seen disembarking?" Their answer: "No record of her." To the FBI, the Coast Guard, the State Department, "Can you help me find my daughter?" Their answer: "We were never notified of a missing person." That's when Kendall understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a clerical error. This was a deliberate act of suppression. Someone, somewhere, had made a decision to silence Marion's disappearance, to erase her. But Kendall refused to let her become a ghost. He hired a private investigator, and that decision would change everything. the investigator uncovered what Celebrity Cruises tried so hard to bury: that a cabin steward had indeed reported Marian missing repeatedly and had been ordered to stop, that her belongings were bagged and thrown away before police were ever notified, that no man overboard protocol was initiated, no security footage reviewed, no search conducted. It was, by every standard of maritime law, a total failure of duty. But that was only the beginning. Digging deeper, Kendall uncovered something even more disturbing. There were no laws requiring cruise lines to report crimes or disappearances to U.S. authorities if the ship was in international waters. No obligation to preserve evidence. No outside oversight. Essentially, once the ship left port, it became a floating world of its own, where accountability could simply be ignored. The more Kendall pressed, the more resistance he faced. Celebrity Cruises, a brand under Royal Caribbean, sent him legal threats. They denied wrongdoing. They refused to release internal reports. They claimed they had no responsibility to report the disappearance of a passenger unless foul play was suspected. But how could foul play be ruled out if no one investigated? Kendall was relentless. He held press conferences. He gave interviews. He brought Marian's face to every newspaper and news show that would listen. He demanded a congressional inquiry. He started an organization, the International Cruise Victims Association, a group that would soon be filled with stories just like his. Because Marian wasn't the only one. Other families came forward, other stories of vanished loved ones, other tales of silence, negligence, and cover-ups aboard luxury cruise liners that promised paradise, but sometimes delivered nightmares. Kendall's campaign was no longer just about his daughter. It became a battle for truth, for justice, and for reform in an industry that had operated unchecked for far too long. What started as a vacation ended as a national scandal, and the walls around Celebrity Cruises were beginning to crack. It had now been over a year since Marian Carver vanished. For most families, grief would have already calcified into quiet resignation. But Kendall Carver was different. Every door that closed made him knock louder. Every denial made him dig deeper. And then he uncovered the document that changed everything. An internal report from Celebrity Cruises. It had been buried in legal files, never intended for public eyes. It was titled Guest Incident Report. Inside the truth, raw, damning, undeniable. It confirmed what Kendall suspected. The cruise line had known Marian was missing within 24 hours of departure. A room attendant had documented her absence, repeatedly, only to be instructed by his superior to stop logging entries. Then, a hotel director on the ship made a chilling decision. Rather than alert authorities, he ordered her belongings to be removed from the room and destroyed. Destroyed. That word struck Kendall like a punch to the chest. His daughter's clothes, her journal, her poetry, every trace of her final days, gone. Evidence, memories, meaning, gone. Why would anyone do that? That's when Kendall realized this wasn't just a case of negligence. It was a strategy. Cruise lines didn't want bad press. A missing passenger headline could tank ticket sales, rattle investor confidence, even spark international investigations. And so, rather than follow protocol, they followed profits. The rot went deeper than anyone imagined. Through his advocacy group, Kendall met other families, parents, spouses, siblings, who shared similar stories. A teenage girl who vanished after a night of dancing. A newlywed husband who never returned to his cabin. A woman who reported an assault only to be locked in her room and threatened. Each story different, but the aftermath the same. No records, no justice, no accountability. In each case, the cruise line was judge, jury, and, sometimes, executioner of the truth. And the U.S. government? It remained disturbingly silent. Maritime law, it turned out, was a labyrinth of loopholes. Ships flying foreign flags, operating in international waters, with no legal duty to report to U.S. agencies. Even when crimes occurred against U.S. citizens, enforcement was vague, fragmented, or non-existent. Kendall took his findings straight to Capitol Hill. And when he sat before Congress, he didn't bring lawyers or lobbyists. He brought Marion's photograph. He told her story. Every chilling detail. The secrecy, the lies, the cover-up, the silence. He didn't beg for sympathy. He demanded answers. His voice cracked not from weakness, but from fury held in place too long. "My daughter didn't just vanish," he said. "She was erased." The room fell silent. Lawmakers looked stunned and ashamed. Because Marion's story wasn't just about one woman lost at sea. It was about the gaping holes in a system that millions of Americans trusted every year. A system where money moved faster than justice, where corporations were trusted to police themselves, where silence was safer than truth. That day, Kendall didn't just speak as a father. He spoke as a whistleblower to an industry's darkest secrets. And behind closed doors, political engines began to stir. Marion's name was finally echoing in the halls of power. But the cruise lines weren't going down without a fight. Behind the glossy brochures, the shimmering decks, and the promises of paradise, the cruise industry was waging a quiet war. Not against pirates or storms, but against scrutiny. As Kendall Carver pressed forward, he was about to discover just how far billion-dollar corporations would go to silence the voices that threatened their image. After his congressional testimony, Kendall thought momentum was on his side. He had public sympathy, media attention, and a growing network of families with their own horror stories. But when the legislative wheels started turning, so did the industry's defense machine. Lobbyists descended on Capitol Hill. The Cruise Lines International Association, CLIA, a powerful trade group representing major cruise companies like Royal Caribbean and Carnival, launched an aggressive campaign to discredit efforts for reform. They argued that the cruise industry was one of the safest vacation options in the world, that disappearances were rare, that adding new laws would be unnecessary and burdensome. Behind closed doors, deals were offered. Political donations flowed. Studies were funded to downplay crime at sea. And the question echoed through the halls of government: how do you regulate what happens in the middle of the ocean? But Kendall didn't back down. He turned his pain into policy. Working with a group of bipartisan lawmakers, he helped draft the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act, a groundbreaking piece of legislation designed to finally close the legal black holes surrounding cruise ship crimes. The act demanded that ships install peepholes and security latches on cabin doors, have video surveillance systems in public areas, provide passengers with clear rights and access to crime reporting, immediately notify the FBI and Coast Guard if a serious incident occurred involving a U.S. citizen, retain all evidence and preserve the scene, just like any crime scene on land. It was the kind of legislation that should have passed in days. Instead, it took 6 years. 6 years of fighting against legal stonewalling, industry lobbying, and bureaucratic inertia. 6 years of telling and retelling Marion's story over and over to anyone who would listen. 6 years of grieving in public, on camera, in courtrooms, and in congressional hearings. All so that what happened to his daughter wouldn't happen to someone else's. And finally, in 2010, Kendall stood on the steps of Capitol Hill with lawmakers and other victim families by his side, as President Obama signed the bill into law. It was a historic moment, the first time in U.S. history that cruise ships were legally required to protect passengers under a federally enforced framework. The act was not perfect, but it was a start, a stake in the ground, a signal to the world that Americans would not tolerate a system where people could vanish and be forgotten. But even then, the battle wasn't over, because while the law now existed, Enforcement was another matter. Cruise lines found ways to sidestep the rules, using flags of convenience and jurisdictional loopholes. Investigations remained rare. Transparency was still a struggle. And worst of all, people were still disappearing. For Kendall, the fight was now bigger than Marion. He became a full-time advocate, speaking across the country, leading the International Cruise Victims Association, and giving voice to the families who couldn't get answers or justice. He turned grief into reform, and reform into a movement. But behind every speech, every headline, every legislative battle, was one haunting question that still had no answer. What really happened to Marion Carver aboard the Celebrity Mercury? Because no body was ever found. No footage was ever released. No cause of death was ever declared. And in the center of it all was a locked room, a destroyed journal, and a silence that screamed louder than any confession. What happens when a person vanishes without a trace, and no one is watching? That's the question that haunted Kendall Carver every night. He had fought for justice, changed laws, and brought national attention to an industry built on silence. And yet, the one thing he could never achieve was closure. Because Marion wasn't just lost. She was erased. The cruise line never offered a definitive explanation for what happened. In their version, Marion Carver boarded the ship, stayed in her room for a day or two, and then, what? Jumped? Fell? Disappeared into thin air? They never said. No timeline, no investigation, no accountability. That left Kendall and the public to ask the most chilling question of all. Was she pushed? The idea that Marion may have taken her own life wasn't one her family dismissed easily. She had struggled with depression. She had made the trip in secret. Her poetry, what little remained, reflected an emotional depth that sometimes bordered on sorrow. But those who knew her best, including her daughter and close friends, insisted that Marion wasn't someone who would simply give up. And even if she had been in pain, didn't she deserve to be found? Didn't she deserve for someone, anyone, to care? But the alternative was far worse. If Marion didn't jump, then what did happen in cabin 6145? There were theories, unproven, unverified, but deeply unsettling. Some speculated she was the victim of foul play, perhaps assaulted and silenced by someone on board. Others believed she may have witnessed something she wasn't supposed to. An internal incident the cruise line needed to cover up. One former crew member, speaking anonymously, claimed that staff were routinely discouraged from reporting complicated incidents, and that the culture on board prioritized reputation above all else. No cameras were reviewed, no passengers were interviewed, and the steward, the one man who tried to raise the alarm, was later reassigned to another ship. His warnings? Ignored. His records? Deleted. His voice? Silenced. Kendall's team tried to obtain CCTV footage from the cruise, hoping for even a glimpse of Marion after that first night. The cruise line said it was automatically erased after a certain number of days. When asked why it wasn't preserved when she was reported missing, they had no answer, or at least none they were willing to give. Every potential lead met a wall, every door locked. And then came the documents. Through legal channels, Kendall's lawyers obtained internal memos and emails between staff on the Celebrity Mercury. Buried within them was a short, devastating sentence: "Do not discuss this with anyone outside the ship." There it was, proof that the company's first instinct was not to report a missing woman, but to hide her disappearance. Not to find Marion, but to manage the risk. Because in the eyes of the cruise industry, Marion wasn't a person. She was a liability. And that's what made her story so terrifying. Because if a guest can vanish without a trace, without a search, without a single piece of evidence left behind, what does that say about the rest of us? What protections do any of us have when we step onto a ship that sails beyond the reach of the law? Marion's case exposed something far bigger than a tragedy. It exposed a truth most people aren't ready to hear. Out there, beyond the shore, there are no rules. In the years following Marion's disappearance, the ripples of her story continued to spread, not just through courtrooms and congressional hearings, but through the hearts of thousands of people who had trusted the illusion of safety at sea. What Marion's case had done was expose a truth that most cruise passengers never considered. You can disappear in paradise, and no one will come looking. The cruise industry thrived on the image of escape, exotic destinations, all-you-can-eat buffets, poolside cocktails under golden sunsets. For millions of travelers, a cruise was the ultimate vacation, a floating dream far from the problems of daily life. But behind that dream was a brutal reality. Since Marion's case went public, hundreds of families began coming forward. Not dozens, hundreds. Stories that had been buried, ignored, or dismissed were finally being heard. People didn't just vanish from cruise ships. They were assaulted. They were robbed. They were silenced. And in most cases, nothing was ever done. The ships weren't just unregulated. They were designed to avoid accountability. Registered under flags of convenience in countries like Panama, the Bahamas, or Liberia, most cruise lines operated outside the reach of American law. That meant no mandatory police force, no legal obligation to report crimes to U.S. authorities, no real transparency. Kendall Carver's advocacy helped shine a blinding light into that darkness. But even with the passage of the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act, even with media exposure and public outrage, the industry adapted. Not by reforming, but by becoming more secretive, more polished, more protective of its image. They installed better PR departments, not better safety protocols. And that's when Kendall made a decision. If the industry wouldn't protect passengers, he would. The International Cruise Victims Association, ICV, founded from the ashes of Marion's story, became a lifeline for families around the world. It grew from a handful of members into a global support network. Parents, widows, survivors, whistleblowers, all connected by a simple, haunting truth. The ocean hides secrets, and the ships are built to keep them. ICV began pushing for international cooperation, for better training of ship personnel, for independent security staff, for mandatory reporting to Interpol. Slowly, painfully, progress was made, but the resistance remained fierce. Cruise lines still found loopholes. Survivors were still gaslit, discouraged, or threatened. And for every case that made headlines, there were dozens more that slipped through the cracks, undocumented, uninvestigated, unresolved. And still, Marion's body was never found. That simple, agonizing fact lingered like a wound that refused to close. Every time Kendall was asked what happened to his daughter, he could only respond with silence. Not because he didn't care, but because no one would let him know. She could have fallen, she could have jumped, she could have been pushed, but the truth had been destroyed along with her belongings, discarded like garbage by a corporation afraid of bad press. That's what Marion Carver's story became. A symbol of a broken system, a corporate machine that valued image over life, a reminder that the smiling crew and pristine cabins could not hide the fact that the moment a ship pulls away from port, it enters a kind of lawless void, where people are free to vanish. And somewhere in that void, Marion was lost. Not just physically, but officially, legally, eternally. No grave, no marker. Just a name that became a cause, a father who became a warrior, and a story that refused to be silenced, no matter how hard they tried to make it disappear. Every time Kendall Carver looked at a cruise ship advertisement, the blue waters, the smiling families, the promises of escape, he didn't see a vacation. He saw a lie, a floating illusion, a machine that had taken his daughter and left behind nothing but questions. By now, Marian had been gone for years. Her room had long been cleaned. Her belongings, her journal, her clothes, her soul, were ashes in a corporate landfill. But in Kendall's mind, Cabin 6145 never emptied. It remained suspended in time, locked in mystery, echoing with the last moments of a woman who simply wanted to disappear for a while, and was instead disappeared forever. And still, the cruise ship sailed on. Celebrity cruises never issued a public apology, never admitted wrongdoing, never acknowledged that a human life had been wiped from their decks like a stain on polished wood. Their legal team argued that no evidence of foul play existed, that without a body, there was no crime, that everything had been handled within protocol. But what protocol involves throwing away a missing woman's belongings before anyone even calls her family? For Kendall, that question became a daily torment. He replayed every moment, every step Marian had taken onto the ship, every second she spent in that room. Did she cry? Did she write? Did someone come in? Was she afraid? He imagined her sitting alone on the balcony, staring into the vast Alaskan waters. Maybe reflecting on her life, maybe writing in her journal, maybe listening to the sound of nothingness. And then, silence. Total, irreversible silence. What makes Marian's case so terrifying isn't just the disappearance, it's the ease of it. The quiet efficiency with which a human being was erased, not by force, but by neglect. Not by villains with weapons, but by corporate policies, managers following procedure, a system designed to look the other way. Because when no one is looking, anything can happen. And when the business model depends on no headlines, no lawsuits, no scandals, people like Marian aren't victims. They're threats. In private, Kendall often wondered, what would have happened if he hadn't fought? If he hadn't made calls, hired lawyers, held press conferences? Would anyone have ever known Marian existed? Would the room attendant's warnings have faded into company records, buried and forgotten? Would Marian have simply become one more ghost in the ocean? Because for every Marian, there are others. Names we don't know. Faces never reported. Cases that never even reached the ears of the families left behind. Crimes at sea are often hidden behind legal smokescreens, international boundaries, and a level of public indifference that corporations exploit to survive. But Kendall didn't let that happen. He refused. He became the voice Marian never had in those final moments, and in doing so, he forced the world to listen. He shattered the illusion of cruise ship invincibility. He demanded laws. He gave other families the strength to speak. And most importantly, he ensured that Marian Carver, a mother, a poet, a woman who once sat alone at sea, would not be forgotten. Not by him, not by the victims who followed, and not by the industry that tried so hard to bury her. Years had passed. The headlines had faded. The hearings were over. And yet, somewhere out there, somewhere in the cold, infinite silence of the sea, Marian Carver remained missing. Her name, once whispered in congressional halls and courtroom testimonies, now lived on in a strange kind of legacy. Not as a statistic, not as a tragedy, but as a catalyst. Because Marian didn't just vanish. She changed everything. Her case became the fulcrum on which an entire industry was forced to shift, even if only slightly. Travel agents began issuing new warnings. Lawmakers started drafting new protocols. Passengers asked different questions before boarding, and survivors of crimes at sea finally had a place to turn. The International Cruise Victims Association, born from Kendall's pain, now standing as a global watchdog for truth. But for Kendall, the fight never truly ended. In interview after interview, he repeated the same words. She walked onto that ship and never walked off, and no one cared. No one even looked. That phrase became a chilling mantra, a reminder that the crime wasn't just the disappearance. The true horror was in the indifference. He would never know what happened in those final moments. He would never know if she jumped or was pushed, or if she slipped quietly into the dark by her own will. But what he did know, and what he made the world understand, is that no human being should vanish without someone being held responsible. Marian's story struck a deep nerve in the public consciousness. Because we all want to believe that when something goes wrong, someone will care, that if we disappear, the world will stop, that systems will activate, that someone will fight for us. But Marian proved that isn't always true. And that's why this story matters. Not because of its mystery, but because of its message. We are only as safe as the systems built to protect us. And when those systems fail, what remains is the love of those who refuse to forget. To this day, when cruise ships set sail and passengers line the decks with champagne flutes and cameras, Kendall Carver thinks of Cabin 6145, a room now rented to strangers, a place now scrubbed clean of the secrets it once held. But in his mind, that cabin will always belong to Marian. And out there, just beyond the edge of the ship's lights, the ocean still holds her. Silent, unforgiving, infinite, but not forgotten. Never forgotten. Because one father decided the story wouldn't end where the record stopped. Because a journal thrown away still spoke louder than corporate silence. Because the truth, no matter how deep it's buried, always finds a way back to the surface. Marian Carver may have vanished, but her impact never did. And now, thanks to one relentless voice, her story will sail on forever.